Have you ever noticed how it ends? Not while you're scrolling, but right after. The screen goes still. Your thumb stops moving. And for a second, you just sit there, staring. Not really thinking, not really feeling, just there. And something feels off. You can't name it exactly, but it's like a quiet drop in your chest, a kind of mental emptiness. You try to brush past it. You tell yourself it was just a break, just a few videos, nothing serious. But if it meant nothing, why does it feel like something is missing? So you reach for the phone again, almost automatically. Not because you're interested, but because you don't want to sit in that feeling. And the moment the next video starts, it disappears. That's the part you don't question. How easily the feeling vanishes the second something else fills the space. Hours pass like this. Clip after clip, voice after voice, idea after idea. And somehow, none of it stays with you. You don't feel informed. You don't feel changed. You don't even feel entertained anymore. Just full and empty at the same time. That contradiction is the signal, because this isn't normal boredom. It's something more specific. Psychology has a name for this kind of experience. It's what happens when your mind is constantly stimulated but never engaged. You're taking in everything, but nothing is actually landing. No friction, no resistance, no meaning, just movement. And for a while, that feels like relief. Because as long as something is happening, you don't have to face what isn't. But the moment it stops, the silence returns. And with it, that same quiet emptiness. But that's not the real problem. Something deeper is happening here. Because this isn't just about scrolling. This is about what you're trying not to feel. You don't scroll because you're curious anymore. That's what it used to be. A quick check, a moment of interest, something new. But now, it's different. You open the app without thinking. You don't search, you don't choose, you just enter. And something takes over from there. Video after video appears. Each one designed to hold you, but not long enough to satisfy you. Just enough to keep you moving. You tell yourself you'll stop soon. After this one. Or the next. But you don't. Because this isn't about content. It's a pattern. Psychology would describe this as a dopamine-driven feedback loop. A cycle where your brain is constantly rewarded but never fulfilled. Each scroll gives you a small spike, a moment of novelty, a flicker of interest, but it fades almost instantly. So you scroll again. Not because you want more, but because the previous moment didn't last. This creates a very specific kind of behavior. You're not engaging, you're chasing. And the more you chase, the less you actually feel. Someone like you starts to notice this, even if you don't say it out loud. You hesitate before opening the app, but you open it anyway. You feel tired while watching, but you keep going. You don't even enjoy it anymore. But stopping feels harder than continuing. That's the loop. And this is where it becomes dangerous, because the brain starts to confuse stimulation with satisfaction. It begins to expect constant input. Silence starts to feel uncomfortable. Stillness feels like something is wrong. So you fill it, again and again. Carl Jung might describe this as a form of unconscious avoidance. Not distraction in the simple sense, but a subtle escape from the self. Because when there's always something external, you never have to turn inward. And at first, that feels like control. You get to choose what you see, what you hear. But over time, you stop choosing. The pattern chooses for you, and you follow it. Not because you want to, but because it's easier than stopping. But that's only the surface, because patterns like this don't form randomly. There's always a reason your mind prefers this loop, and it's not what you think. Something deeper is driving it. It doesn't start with the phone. It starts in the moment right before you reach for it. A small pause, almost invisible. You're about to do something. Think, work, decide, feel something you've been avoiding. And then you hesitate, not dramatically, not consciously, just enough. And in that gap, your mind looks for an exit. That's when the urge appears. Not strong, not urgent, just familiar. You pick up the phone, not because you plan to, but because it removes the tension. That's the mechanism. This isn't about entertainment. It's about interruption. You're interrupting something internal. A thought that was forming. A feeling that was rising. A question you didn't want to answer. And instead of staying with it, you replace it. With movement, with noise, with something easier. This is where people misunderstand the problem. They think the issue is distraction. It's not. Distraction is just the tool. The real driver is avoidance. Avoidance of friction. Avoidance of uncertainty. Avoidance of facing something unfinished inside you. Because when nothing is happening externally, something starts happening internally. And that can feel uncomfortable. Sometimes it's subtle. A sense that you should be doing more. A quiet pressure you can't explain. Other times it's sharper. Doubt, restlessness, a question about where you're going. So your mind does something very efficient. It replaces depth with stimulation. Because stimulation is easy to process. It doesn't ask anything from you. No responsibility, no decision, no identity, just passive consumption. And this is where it becomes precise. The brain learns that scrolling is not just enjoyable, it's protective. It shields you from contact with yourself. Carl Jung spoke about this in a different language. He described the avoidance of the unconscious. The parts of you that haven't been faced, integrated, understood. When those parts begin to surface, you feel tension. And instead of turning toward it, you turn away into something immediate, something controlled, something shallow enough to keep you from going deeper. This is not weakness, it's strategy. Your mind is trying to keep you stable, trying to prevent discomfort, trying to avoid something it doesn't know how to handle yet. But there's a cost. Because every time you interrupt that internal moment, you train yourself to escape it. You lose the ability to stay with your own thoughts, your own questions, your own direction. And over time, that creates a very specific kind of emptiness. Not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is being processed. Nothing is being faced. Nothing is being built. It only feels like you're doing something, but you're not. You're avoiding something. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to stop. Not because scrolling is powerful, but because what you're avoiding is still waiting for you. And this is the part no one sees. The content isn't the addiction. The escape is. At first, nothing seems wrong. You're just spending time, relaxing, unwinding. It feels harmless, but slowly, something starts to change. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet one. You begin to notice it in small moments. You try to focus, and your mind slips. You try to think deeply, and something resists. You sit in silence, and it feels heavier than it should. So you reach for the phone again. Not because you want to, but because it's easier than staying there. This is where the pattern turns into something else. Not just a habit, but a kind of erosion. Your attention starts to fragment. Not completely, just enough that depth becomes harder. You can still think, but not for long. You can still focus, but not without effort. And anything that requires stillness starts to feel uncomfortable. This is not fatigue. This is conditioning. Your mind has adapted to constant stimulation. So when that stimulation disappears, it doesn't feel like rest. It feels like loss. And this is the part no one talks about. The way your inner world starts to thin out. You don't reflect like you used to. You don't question things the same way. You don't sit with ideas long enough to let them develop. Everything becomes shorter, faster, shallower, even your own thoughts. You begin to live on the surface of your mind. And over time, that creates a quiet disconnection, not just from your goals, but from yourself. Because identity isn't built in motion. It's built in stillness. In the moments where you face your own thoughts, your own contradictions, your own direction. But those moments are the ones you keep interrupting. So nothing settles. Nothing integrates. Nothing becomes clear. Carl Jung warned about this in a different way. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And this is what it looks like. You start to feel stuck, but you don't know why. You feel unmotivated, but you can't explain it. You feel disconnected, but everything on the surface looks fine. Because the real issue isn't visible. It's happening internally. You are slowly losing contact with your own depth. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Because the emptiness you feel after scrolling isn't just from what you consumed. It's from what you didn't face. All the thoughts you interrupted, all the questions you avoided, all the tension you escaped. They don't disappear. They accumulate. And instead of becoming clarity, they become noise. A low-level confusion that follows you. So you try to fix it the same way. More content, more input, more distraction. But it doesn't work. Because this is not a lack of stimulation. This is a lack of integration. And no amount of scrolling will fix that. It only makes it quieter. For a while, but the silence always comes back. And when it does, it feels heavier than before. Because now, there's more waiting underneath it. This didn't start with your phone. The pattern was already there. The phone just made it easier. Think about the feeling you avoid when everything goes quiet. That subtle tension, that restlessness, that sense that you should be doing something, but you don't know what. That feeling is not new. You've felt it before. Long before scrolling became automatic. Maybe it showed up when you were younger, when there was nothing to distract you. No constant input, no endless stream of content. Just you and your own thoughts. And that didn't always feel safe. Not because something dramatic was happening, but because you were left alone with uncertainty. Maybe you learned, early on, that stillness wasn't comfortable. That being alone with your thoughts led to overthinking, or pressure, or a quiet sense that you weren't doing enough. So you adapted. You found ways to fill the space. At first, it was harmless. TV in the background, music always playing, something to keep your mind occupied. Not because you were weak, but because it helped you regulate something internal. A kind of low-level discomfort, a background tension that never fully went away. And over time, your brain learned something important. Silence equals discomfort. Stimulation equals relief. That association stayed with you. It followed you into adulthood. And when technology evolved, it gave you the perfect tool. Something immediate, endless, effortless. A constant stream of distraction that could override any internal state. So now, every time that old feeling appears, you don't have to sit with it. You can remove it instantly. And this is where the pattern becomes deeply rooted. Because it's no longer just about habit. It's tied to emotional memory, to the way you learn to deal with discomfort, to the way you learn to avoid certain internal states. Someone like you doesn't scroll just because it's available. You scroll because it works. It numbs the tension. It fills the silence. It delays the confrontation. But it also prevents something else. It prevents you from ever updating that old response, from realizing that the feeling you avoid isn't actually dangerous. It just feels unfamiliar. Because you've spent so much time escaping it, this is not about blame. It's about understanding. Your behavior makes sense. It's consistent. It's predictable. But that doesn't mean it's harmless. Because every time you follow the same loop, you reinforce the same association. Stillness is bad. Distraction is relief. And the longer that stays true, the harder it becomes to sit with yourself without needing something to fill the space. But that's exactly where the shift has to happen. Not in the app, not in the content, but in your relationship with that feeling, the one you've been avoiding for years. The shift doesn't start when you delete the app. It starts earlier than that. In the moment you feel the urge and don't immediately act on it, that small pause you usually skip is where everything changes. Because for the first time, you're not escaping, you're noticing. You feel the tension, the restlessness, that subtle discomfort rising in your chest, and instead of replacing it, you stay. Not to fight it, not to fix it, just to see it clearly. This is where most people misunderstand change. They think it comes from control, from forcing new behavior, from cutting things out. But this isn't about control. It's about contact. Contact with the exact thing you've been avoiding. Because once you can stay with that feeling, even for a few seconds, it starts to lose its power. Not because it disappears, but because you're no longer running from it. This is what real awareness looks like. Not thinking about your behavior, not analyzing it after the fact, but catching it in real time, right at the edge of the habit. You notice your hand reaching, you pause, and suddenly you see the pattern. Clear, simple, predictable. And in that moment, you have a choice. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet one. Do I follow this again? Or do I stay here a little longer? This is not about discipline. This is about tolerance. Your ability to tolerate your own internal state without needing to escape it. And at first, that feels uncomfortable because you're breaking a pattern your brain trusts. You're removing the thing that used to protect you, so the discomfort might increase. The urge might feel stronger. The silence might feel heavier. But this is where it becomes real. Because now, you're not numbing it. You're facing it. And something unexpected starts to happen. The feeling changes. Not instantly, but subtly. What once felt overwhelming becomes something you can observe. A thought, a sensation, a passing state. Not something you need to act on. And this is where the shift deepens. Because when you stop interrupting your own mind, it begins to organize itself. Thoughts become clearer. Questions become more defined. Direction starts to emerge. Not because you forced it, but because you gave it space. This is what you've been missing. Not more information, not more content, but time with your own mind, without interference. Nietzsche wrote about the importance of solitude, not as isolation, but as a necessary space for becoming. And this is what that looks like in practice. Not grand, not dramatic, just you, sitting with your own thoughts, long enough for something real to form. This is not progress in the usual sense. It doesn't feel productive. It doesn't give you immediate results, but it's something deeper. You're rebuilding your ability to stay, to think, to feel, to face. And once that starts to return, the need to constantly escape begins to fade. Not because scrolling disappears, but because you no longer need it in the same way. And that's the difference. You're not forcing yourself to stop. You're outgrowing the need to escape. There's nothing wrong with you. The emptiness you feel is not a flaw. It's a signal, a quiet indication that something inside you is being ignored, interrupted, left unfinished. And for a long time, you found a way to avoid it. Quickly, efficiently, almost perfectly, you filled the silence. You softened the tension. You stayed just far enough away from yourself to not feel it fully. But the feeling never left. It waited. In the background, in the pauses, in the moments when everything stopped. And every time you noticed it, you moved away again. Not because you're weak, because it was easier, because no one showed you what to do with it. So you learned to replace it. With noise, with movement, with something immediate. But now you see it, not as emptiness, but as something else, something unfinished, something asking for your attention. And the strange part is, it doesn't need to be solved. It just needs to be faced, quietly, without distraction, without escape, without replacing it with something easier. Because the moment you stop running from it, it changes. It becomes clearer, more defined, less overwhelming than it first felt. And eventually, it stops feeling like emptiness at all. It starts to feel like space. Space to think, to question, to understand, to become something more deliberate. But that only happens if you stay. If you let the moment last a little longer than usual, if you don't immediately reach for something to fill it, because that instinct, that automatic movement toward distraction, that's the old pattern. And now, you can see it. You don't need to fight it. You just need to notice it and pause, even briefly, because in that pause, you return to yourself, not the distracted version, not the constantly stimulated one, but the one underneath all of it, the one you've been avoiding, the one that's still there, waiting for you to stop scrolling and finally look back.